Have you ever thought about how much carbon dioxide you emit in 1 year? Maybe you take the bus to school and back every day. Maybe you drive a car to work or to the store. Maybe you take a plane a few times a year for business or to visit family. But with all the digital technology available to us today, are those emissions really necessary? After all, you can email important documents to coworkers, video chat with friends and family, and even shop, order food, and watch movies online. So what if you lowered your carbon emissions simply by moving as much of your life online as possible? And what if everyone on Earth did the same? Would we finally have a solution to the climate change crisis? Until recently, this had been a purely hypothetical question. That is until the early months of 2020, when normal human activities were brought to a virtual standstill by a pandemic, as a newly discovered coronavirus spread rampantly across the globe. With no preventative vaccine or effective treatment available, and the death toll increasing at an alarming rate, governments around the world issued shelter-in-place orders for their country's citizens. As a result, people found ways to work and play digitally, without leaving their homes for months on end. And just like that, humans were thrust into the largest climate experiment ever. So what were the results? Thanks to the lockdowns, global carbon dioxide emissions took a nosedive for the first time in decades. For example, industrial goods like steel, cement, and certain chemicals which rely on burning fossil fuels for their production are normally responsible for approximately 29% of our global CO2 emissions. In the first 6 months of 2020, emissions from the industrial sector fell by 5.5%. Since people were staying home, ground transportation, which is normally responsible for 18% of our global CO2 emissions, fell by 18.8%. The aviation industry took the biggest hit of all, since very few people could travel internationally. Air travel normally contributes about 2.5% of our CO2 emissions, but in the first half of 2020, that amount fell by nearly 44%. CO2 emissions from the power sector, which normally contributes approximately 28% of our global emissions, fell by 10.3%. Surprisingly, even though people were staying home, the remainder of our CO2 emissions, which mostly comes from commercial and residential buildings, only showed slight, non-significant changes. In total, experts estimate that our CO2 emissions will have decreased by 2.4 billion tons in 2020 as compared to 2019. At first glance, this may seem like cause for celebration, but let's look a little closer. 2.4 billion tons may seem like a huge number, but it's actually tiny compared to the over 40 billion tons of CO2 we emit every year. That means that our carbon emissions fell by only 5 to 8% in total. And consider that this was only achieved by billions of humans drastically disrupting their lives. If we were to try and achieve carbon net neutrality this way, we would have to shelter in place progressively harder in the upcoming years, which is clearly impossible given the huge mental and economic hardships we all faced. In fact, experts are already predicting that this drop in emissions will only be a temporary dip in our CO2 emissions growth trend. As a COVID-19 vaccine is distributed to people worldwide, life will return to normal, and we will go back to burning fossil fuels for work and travel. In places where lockdowns have been lifted, scientists are already observing that CO2 emissions are rebounding back to pre-pandemic levels. However, we have still learned some valuable lessons by sheltering in place that can help the environment moving forward. For example, more businesses can allow employees to work from home whenever possible to reduce car emissions. Overseas meetings and conferences have the option of being held online, which will reduce emissions from air travel. And just as communities rallied around small businesses during the pandemic, continuing to buy local goods and services will reduce emissions from shipping and transportation. However, the pandemic has also made it abundantly clear that we cannot rely on these changes alone to solve the climate crisis. In order to bring the 40 billion tons of CO2 we emit down to zero, it is essential that we also invest in clean energy and carbon capture technologies. The pandemic gave us a rare chance to stop and collectively reflect on our lifestyles. If we all work together to make a green recovery, we can not only hold on to what we value, but help the environment as well.